which I would like to call to order. May we have the roll call, please?
Karen Kahn,
Here.
Bruce Miller,
Here.
John Clark,
Here.
William Gilbert,
Here.
Patricia Griffin, Dolores Johnson, Kirk Martin.
Are there any changes to the agenda?
No, Madam Chair.
Thank you. This is the time for public comment. Any member can address the commission on a subject that is not scheduled before us this evening. Do we have any comment slips?
Have none.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the notices, the lease sub-review committee met on Wednesday, September 12th, 3 p.m. And number two, that on Thursday, the 13th at 3 p.m., the commission's secretary posted this agenda. And finally, that the noise abatement committee will meet on Wednesday, September 26th at 10 a.m. in the Airport Administration Building. Moving on to the consent calendar. Do I have a motion regarding, or are there any items that anybody would like to take separately?
I don't think so.
Okay,
Make a motion that we accept the consent calendar.
it's been moved
And I'll second it.
and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It carries. Moving on to administrative reports.
Our item on the administrative agenda is regarding the city's utility users tax, and here this evening is Bob Pearson, who is the city finance director, to give an explanation of the proposed measure.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mabel. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Bob Pearson. I'm the city's finance director, and I'd like to start by thanking you for allowing me a few minutes of your time on your agenda this evening to talk about Measure G. Measure G is a ballot measure that the City Council on July 1st voted unanimously to place before the voters of the City of Santa Barbara this November 4th. It is a measure which will, if approved by the voters, amend a portion of the city's utility users tax, specifically the portion of the utility users tax that is levied on telephone and cable TV service. And you may ask, Bob, why are you here? And the answer to that question is that as part of the decision-making process that the City Council went through in deciding to place Measure G before the voters this November, they did conduct a citizen opinion survey. And one of the things that survey indicated quite clearly was that there was and is a general lack of understanding in the community about the city's utility users tax in general, and certainly about the issues revolving around Measure G particularly. And so the council directed staff to prepare a public information effort to try to educate the community about the utility users tax and Measure G, so that when individuals go to the polls on November 4th and step into the voting booth, hopefully they will feel that they have enough information on the matters at hand to decide for themselves whether they wish to vote for or against Measure G. And so really that's my job, is to go out, and I've been going to all the city's boards, commissions, committees, civic groups, neighborhood groups, trying to present information on the utility users tax and the issues around Measure G, and answer any questions I can. As you may or may not know, under state law, public resources may not be used to advocate for or against any ballot measure or candidate. And so my job is not to convince anybody of anything, but hopefully to provide impartial information that then allows citizens to make up their own minds on the merits of the measure. So with that, what is the UUT? It's a utility users tax. It's a tax that the city has had in place since the 1970s. It provides revenue to both the city's general fund and the city's streets funds. In fact, the revenue from our utility tax is split 50% between the general fund and our streets fund. So the general fund portion of the revenue goes to provide local funding for public safety, police, fire, 911 emergency communications, parks and recreation, library, community development services. And the 50% that goes to the streets fund obviously goes to maintain the the city's roads and streets, potholes, repairs, and basic infrastructure maintenance of the city's roads and streets. We're not alone. Over 150 cities and counties in the state of California have a utility users tax. Ours is a 6% tax levied on 6 different utility services: water, electric, natural gas, trash service or refuse, cable television, and telephone. And as I mentioned, Measure G only has to do with those last 2, cable, TV, and telephone. So what is the utility users tax in terms of the revenue? For the most recently completed fiscal year, which ended June 30th of this year, fiscal year 08, the city received almost, just over $13.1 million of total revenue from the utility users tax. And again, because it is split 50-50, that means that the general fund got about $6.5 million, and the city streets funds got about $6.5 million. Now I have bolded on this slide the 2 components that are the subject of Measure G, and you'll notice that's telecommunications at almost $3.9 million and cable TV at just over $1.25 million. Combined, those 2 pieces total $5.1 million. So the Measure G revenue, which I'll describe in greater detail momentarily, currently generates about $5.1 million. Again, half of streets and half for the general fund. And there you see the $5.1 million, and I'm not going to spend any time because I've already said this. In the current fiscal year, which is 09, what you see here is that $5.1 million allocated 50-50 between the streets fund and the general fund. But the point of this slide is to show within the general fund how those funds are allocated. Now, I've allocated these funds in this slide based on budget because the general fund portion is a general tax. It's not dedicated to any particular purpose within the general fund, so it is essentially allocated pro rata based on the budget. Since public safety is half of the general fund's budget, roughly half of the general fund's portion of the Measure G utility users tax on telephone and cable TV is allocated to public safety. 25% of the total, that's half of the general fund's piece, just over $1.25 million. Other large components go to Parks and Recreation, Community Development, Public Works, and even the administrative departments. So why did the City Council decide at this time to place this measure on the ballot? The answer to that is twofold, and both of the reasons arise out of the fact that I mentioned earlier, which is that the city's ordinance taxing telephone and cable TV dates to the 1970s. That means they're almost 40 years old. And number one is we all know that in the last 40 years, technology has changed just a tad. I say that tongue-in-cheek. Of course, technology has changed rather dramatically since the 1970s. And what was a current ordinance in the 70s is now woefully out of date in terms of addressing technology the way it is currently used. The other and unfortunate piece of it is that due to a change in federal law about 2 years ago, specifically the elimination of the federal excise tax on telephone service, due to that change in federal tax law, a number of California cities, not including Santa Barbara, but a number of California cities with telephone utility taxes very similar to ours are currently being challenged in court by the telephone companies who are arguing that due to the change in federal tax law, these local utility taxes on telephone services are now no longer valid. Now, those cities are vigorously contesting those lawsuits, and there is no certainty as to what the outcome of that litigation would be. But given the fact that an adverse decision in that litigation very likely would result in the loss of our own telephone utility tax revenue of about $4 million a year, the City Council felt that in an abundance of caution, it would be prudent to ask the voters to reauthorize the existing telephone and cable TV utility users taxes in order to immunize ourselves from that potential adverse litigation outcome. So really, it's designed to protect our current revenue source by asking the voters to update our utility tax by removing the references to the federal law. Now, as long as we were going to the voters to ask them to accomplish that, it certainly made sense to modernize the ordinances as well to recognize, as I said, the changing technology. And so that's what Measure G really is. It accomplishes, if passed, two things. One is it protects an existing city revenue source by conforming with current federal law, as well as updating the the definitions in the ordinances to reflect modern technology. And I want to pause to give you a couple examples of what I mean by modern technology. The one I traditionally use is, you may have heard of a telephone service called named Vonage, a company. They're advertising fairly extensively on TV right now, actually, these days. They provide telephone service just like Verizon does. Same handset, you pick up the handset, you get a dial tone, you punch in somebody's number, and if you're lucky, your party at the other end of the line answers. The difference is that unlike Verizon, which routes the call over a pair of twisted copper wires, Vonage routes the call, they digitize it, and route it over the internet. Because that is considered what's called voice over internet protocol telephone, it currently falls outside the scope of our 40-year ordinance, because 40 years ago there was no internet, let alone telephone service over it. So what we have is a situation now where Verizon customers, as an example, with traditional home telephone service are paying our 6% utility tax. Vonage customers in Santa Barbara are not. And as technology continues to evolve, we would see an erosion of our existing utility tax revenue. By modernizing the ordinance and by developing technology-neutral definitions, we achieve tax equity so that all users and service suppliers are treated the same, and so that we make sure that we are well positioned for the future as well, and the city gets to maintain its existing revenue. And so the nutshell of it is that we currently tax telephone service. If Measure G passes, we will continue to tax telephone service. That's really the object, is from a layperson's definition, is to maintain our telephone utility users tax. Now, the council did recognize that Measure G does and would expand the base of the tax a bit by including these newer technologies that are used to deliver the same services. And in recognition of that, the council voted unanimously to place this measure on the ballot at a lower rate. So Measure G, if approved, would lower the city's utility users tax rate on both cable TV and telephone services from 6 to 5.75%. And it's city's best estimate that would generate a revenue neutral situation. In other words, the city would receive the same amount of total revenue from the tax as we currently do. So a slight expansion of the base, a lowering of the rate, and the same amount, hopefully, of revenue to be generated from the tax. What you see here is the actual ballot language that voters will see when they step in and get their ballot on November 4th. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I know you'll thank me for that. But I will read the first couple lines. It says, shall Santa Barbara adopt an ordinance reducing the telecommunication utility users tax from 6 to 5.75%. Then it goes on to list all the services that the tax revenue supports. It mentions exempting low-income seniors, which is something that our existing utility users tax ordinance already does, and Measure G would maintain that. Prohibiting any future tax rate increase without additional voter approval. Requiring equal treatment of taxpayers regardless of technology. Annual audits, public review of expenditures, and local control of all revenue. So in summary, Measure G would adopt a modern communications tax ordinance. It would solve both the litigation and technology risks by using modern definitions that are technology neutral, and would provide tax equity so that all users and service suppliers are treated the same. I did mention that over 150 cities and counties in this state have a utility users tax. This litigation risk and the technology risk is not something that's unique to Santa Barbara. Already, throughout the state. Over 26 cities in California have taken very similar measures to their voters, and without exception, every one of them was approved, some with approval rates as high as 89%. I should mention that in order to pass, Measure G needs majority approval, 50% plus one. Election Day is November 4th. Voting by mail begins in about 3 weeks, October 6th. And I'm sure in this room we're all already registered to vote, but if you know someone who isn't, the deadline to register to vote is October 20th. Additional information can be found on the city's website, including the ballot measure, which you just saw, the actual proposed ordinance, all of the resolutions and staff reports that went to council, arguments both for and against Measure G, and the rebuttals of those arguments both for and against Measure G, links to additional information, and of course the entire website is also available in Spanish. There are a couple things I would like to mention, because as I've done these presentations, I get questions, of course, and a couple things I'd like to clarify. Number one is that our current utility tax ordinance does not allow us to tax internet access. So the amount of monthly bill that a citizen pays to Cox Communications or to Verizon for DSL service is not taxed currently by our utility tax. Measure G would not change that. In fact, it specifically prohibits the city from taxing internet access now or in the future. And that doesn't matter whether that internet access is at your home computer, or if you have a BlackBerry, iPhone, smartphone, whatever. If you have internet access on your handheld device, that also is excluded specifically from the tax. So we do not tax internet access. I've also had people say to me, Bob, you just want to tax my cell phone. And I sort of hang my head sheepishly and say, no, I'm sorry, we already do and have for 15 years. So that isn't it either. Essentially what it is the same basic, sort of from a layperson's perspective, the same basic services that we tax now, we want to continue to tax, and we want to be able to tax the new ways of providing those services. And in order to be able to do that, we are able to recommend a lowering of the tax rate. So that concludes my presentation, and I would, of course, be glad to answer any questions. And I want to thank you once again for your patience and your time.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
I have one.
Go ahead. So do I.
Oh, great. You mentioned that 26 other communities have already adopted language similar to this. In your analysis, how successful have those communities been in getting the kind of the non-incumbent or the non-traditional providers to comply with the taxation requirements to apply that, given that some of them are fairly new, they don't have the articulated billing systems that some of our traditional utilities have had?
Mr. Miller, that's a great question, and we've already started to look at that. Some of these communities got voter approval as far back as November of 2006. So they are well on the road or had already completed their implementation of these new ordinances. We've been following up with those cities to see what their experience has been. And they did have difficulty in the beginning. But I think now with 25 or 26 of cities that have managed to go through this process now, it's starting to become well developed in terms of the administrative infrastructure that's necessary to get this implemented. Of course, Verizon, AT&T, they've been in this business long enough that they have the infrastructure in place, but Vonage is an example. The other example is on the television side. You might ask, why is cable TV involved in this? And the answer to that is because, as everybody knows nowadays, that cable companies are in telephone and internet, phone companies are in television and internet, and they all call it the triple play. And we don't have it here yet, but we're a Verizon community, not an AT&T community. Verizon, as close as Ventura County, is currently offering what a layperson would call cable TV. technically, it's called IPTV, Internet Protocol Television. To the user, it appears the same. It's television service with a remote and a box and all that, but it's routed over the Internet. That would fall currently outside of our existing cable TV ordinance. But there again, my point really is that Verizon has the infrastructure in place to deal with that. Vonage now is learning. And there are other, I should mention, internet-based phone services. One particular that people may have heard of is Skype. And people ask me, would Skype be taxable service? And I say, well, it might be, but it's kind of a moot point because Skype is a free service, and 6% of zero is zero. And so there really isn't too much of an issue there. But it is something we're looking at. We have worked together with the other cities. The city actually has a consulting attorney that is probably the most highly regarded expert on utility tax issues in the state of California and advises the League of California Cities and individual cities throughout the state. That's why we all end up with the same basic fundamental ordinance. And that's why we're all in the same boat, because back in the 70s we all ended up with the same basic ordinance that now has those same flaws in it as a result of the change in federal law. Sorry, more than you asked.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm curious to know how many cities turned it down?
Not one.
Okay. Grant.
Oh.
Madam Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Grant House. I'm your liaison to the City Council, and I'm very glad that Bob is here today making this presentation not only just for you, but for the public at large, because what I think is the most important thing that can happen right now is that the public has a chance to learn about what's being proposed before they get to the ballot box, and that they have an understanding of its value and why it would even be up for a decision for them. And just to reflect back a little bit, one of the things that I've learned being on the City Council has been how useful the utility users tax that we have had so far has been, and how it has Santa Barbara stand out against the background of those cities who haven't taken that step or didn't the number of years ago that we did. It's monies, for instance, that can magnify it's in our discretion how it's used. The monies can go, as you've seen, to our streets and to roads, basic infrastructure. We can provide, for instance, 11% of a bridge replacement in downtown Santa Barbara and then be able to accomplish 89% of the costs through federal funding that comes to the state. But if we did not have the local resources, we wouldn't be able to compete for those funds. Another similar kind of thing has to do with just the ability to run the everyday part of our ship. It has to do with, as you saw, the essential services. And for us to have the local discretionary funds to be able to do that, where we're not prescribed in any way from an outside agency, that we can put them where our populace really appreciates it. This is critical, and that's why utility users tax can be so useful. So without advocating for it, I want to be one of the informational parts of the presentation here and just say we're very, very keen and interested in how the voters will respond to this come November. But also truly to thank you and to thank Bob for going out on the road and making this presentation so more people can understand it. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
We're ready for the director's report?
We are ready for the director's report.
All right. I know you've been waiting all evening for this. The first item that I'd like to report on is our passenger count for August was up 3.4% as compared to August of last year. And we're up year-to-date through August 4.4% compared to the same period last year. A good amount of that can be attributed to ExpressJet's service. And I would expect in September, October, we'll probably see a slight decrease in our passenger count, but then as Horizon comes online with Sacramento, hopefully we'll come back up for November and December. And I'm hoping we'll finish the year on a slight uptick. Air service, as you received the press release. Horizon has announced they will start Sacramento service on November 9th. We're very excited about that. We've had a group of business leaders in the community who wrote letters to support the service that we sent along with our package to Horizon. And one of their frequent Sacramento flyers, a business person, he told me he's already bought 8 tickets between November 9th and January 1st. So he goes quite frequently to Sacramento. So I told him, tell all your friends and take your friends with you. So we'll hopefully that will be just as successful as it was with ExpressJet. It's a bigger jet. It's a 70-seat RJ as opposed to the 50 seats. So we have 20 more seats to fill.
Karen, do we know what the load factor was on the Portland flight to begin with, and will that be bumping off Portland passengers because people are filling the seats to Sacramento and they can't get on as a through passenger?
Well, actually, we would have lost Portland anyway because the loads just were not high enough. So hopefully this will serve 2 purposes.
Great.
And particularly since Sacramento was so successful.
Kind of a win-win. You can still get to Portland and you
Right.
can go to San.
Yeah,
I like it.
I agree. The other item that I wanted to point out was Highway 101 and 217 airport signage. That might seem like a weird thing to point out. We've been trying to convince and then work with Caltrans over the last 5 years, to improve signage to the airport. The airline ticket agents receive constant complaints about the inadequate signage for people to get off the freeway at the right exits and get to the airport. So we are into this month. We should see our signs up, and you might want to notice them coming northbound on 101 before you get to Fairview, 217 coming toward the airport, and I believe coming northbound and getting off at Fairview. There should be additional signage and that says Santa Barbara Airport even, not just generic airport. So we're very glad. It took a long time. It was good to have it done, though. The other thing I would like to point out is that we vacillate between calling it Phase 1 or not calling it Phase 1, but the terminal project, the terminal ramp, and the remaining portion of aligning Taxiway B with the north portion is under construction right now. We've received bids on the interim or temporary improvements for the terminal project, which, if you recall, that'll change the roadway, the loop road, and essentially set up the site for construction of the new building. Those bids came in almost $1 million under engineer's estimate, but we have had a bid protest, so they have to go through a process of reevaluating the bids, and so I don't know what the result of that is. But we're a little bit delayed because of that, but we'll are continuing on at hopefully a good pace after that. Our rental car quick turnaround facility construction has begun on that, and we had one little hitch in that project. One of the World War II underground fuel tanks, the big concrete tanks, we thought we got them all, but discovered there was one in the old granite construction yard that we didn't find when we removed those years ago. So we had to pause a minute in the before we started construction and remove that, but that's well underway as well. So always interesting doing a project at the airport. And that's really on the director's report, the items that I wanted to point out. If there's any other item on here that you would like me to speak to, of course, I'd be happy to.
I'm curious about the hydro mulching operations that are going to begin. Do we have some kind of a PR program to advise the citizens, and we're just waiting till it starts before they get the news?
We're working with the county and City of Goleta The City of Goleta is holding, has neighborhood meetings scheduled, as well as a business meeting, or a meeting for businesses along Hollister Corridor. We also have a tenant meeting scheduled for September 24th at 5:30.
Yes.
This starts?
The tour
In the, the tour center, or the visitor center.
Yes.
So we will, and there's press releases that we'll be putting out. I'm also seeing if our maintenance staff can spruce up the observation area where the, since it's going, the air operation for the hydromulching is going to take place on the former Forest Service Air Attack Base ramp. Seeing if we can kind of spiff up that little observation area, because I'm sure just like people enjoy coming out to watch the air attack airplanes when we had a forest fire, they'll enjoy watching the hydromulching operation as well. And then we'd hold a press conference the day that the operations start so that the press can get their pictures and that sort of thing. So we will get the word out. You know, I don't know, having 2 weeks' notice doesn't really do anything, but as long as we're a couple days or a few days in advance. So we are all working toward that end.
What are the planned hours of operation?
Sunrise to sunset. The one contractor, and I'm not sure if it was the contractor that actually got the job, said their actual air time, while they'll operate about 10 hours a day, their actual air time would be about 8 hours and about 13-minute turns, I think, they figured. So
Is
going to be
that
interesting.
turn the time it takes them to come in, land, refuel, and go out again, or is that the time that they will be gone and then return to the airport?
Gone. My understanding is take off,
Yeah, it's
dump their load, and then come back.
a 13-minute lag.
Yeah. And we will be meeting next week with the tower, the contractor, City of Goleta, County, just so that we're all on kind of the same page and have the same understanding of what those operations are going to be like. I'm looking at it more from that those agencies know what the community's going to be experiencing. I don't want them to underestimate that.
Well, I hope they pick one of those catchy operation names. I was going to suggest Operation Green Thunder.
I'll forward your suggestion to the Forest Service.
Actually, we could do something like, the little Dutch boy on the dike. This is kind of holding back the...
Yeah, well, that's how I feel that the airport's doing for the rest of the watershed.
I was going to mention that Commissioner Khan and I attended last week's, I guess it was a session for local businesses to get information on the terminal program, air service changes, this project. And it was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure if there's groups out there that would be willing to have her dispense that information, she'd be happy to attend some groups
Yeah,
for
I'd
that.
love
because
to.
I think it's,
Actually, I've already been asked to speak to a Rotary Club, so and then Commissioner Miller put out the word to the Flying Club, so, yeah.
Very good
There's nothing
presentation.
we love more than to talk about the airport, so.
Great. Any other questions?
Any other-
Okay. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mine.